Hi, welcome to this session of the Turn series. We've got an eminent person here who is goes by the moniker of Mr. Open Banking, who's played several roles across his 25 years rich industry experience. He's built products. He's been the head of integration at CIBC Canada. Now he's the head of open banking at Axway, and he's got a podcast by name Mr. Open Banking. So he evangelizes open banking, and then he is also responsible for API integration products and the whole entire ecosystem at Axway. And he was responsible for, he was part of a team that built a product which was an award-winning product which built APIs using the open banking framework at his earlier stint. So welcome, Eyal. Good morning to you over there. I hope it's a bright Toronto sun over there. I'm not sure what is the weather like, but welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here, Ken.
And do walk us through your journey on how it's been over these last 2 decades plus of your experience. What have you been working with? I know you actually had your own company to start off with, I think for 10 plus years or something. You are a founder of your own company called Eldon Software. And how did that happen? And then how did you chance building products, interesting products, and now the open banking ecosystem itself?
Yeah. It's funny, I think, for anyone who's been in IT for a long time to reflect on their history, because of course there's what you personally went through, and then this incredible rise of IT over those same decades. There's no question that I got my start through my dad. My dad was an IT veteran, 40 years in the industry, dwarfing even my 25, and he got his start with punch cards. I mean, he was one of those original guys who took computer science at Technion, an eminent university in Israel, the first year that they offered a computer science program. You didn't have computers, you had one computer, and it was a building, and you had to book time to walk into the building and feed your punch cards into the computer, and that was how programming began. So he was there at the beginning, and he very much passed that love of computers on to me. Fast forward to the 90s, and as part of his job, he starts encountering this new thing called the internet. And he comes to me, I remember it well, when I was about 16. This would have been, let's see, around 1992. And he says, this internet thing is going to be a big deal. How can we take advantage of it? How can we build a business? And I said, well, the ISP market is getting a little saturated, which I was wrong about, of course. Little did I know how big the internet would get. So let's not start an ISP. Let's start a web development company. And he said, okay, what would you need to start a web development company? Now, like all teenagers, I wanted a new computer. So I said, a new computer. And he said, how much would a new computer cost? And at the time, this was like a Pentium 100, if memory serves, something in that range.
Yeah, 256
and it was about
MB. I think the max memory was 256 MB. But
yeah, that's right. And even that was thousands of dollars. I think the PC, average top of the line PC around that time was about $5,000. So I said a new PC, about $5,000. Said, where would you get $5,000? I guess I could go to a bank. I said, okay, tell you what, I will buy you a new PC if you promise to learn this new internet stuff and figure out how it works and try and build websites. And I said, deal, because I wanted a new computer. So he agreed, and next thing you know, I'm in my parents' basement with my Pentium, with an ISDN line, learning Perl, learning Unix, learning HTML, early days of HTML, and starting a company called Eldon Software. A little bit of insider knowledge. Before it was Eldon Software, it had a different name. It was called Cyber Young, after Yonge Street here in Toronto, the longest street in the world.
Okay.
And I literally walked up and down Yonge Street with a suitcase in my teens, and inside the suitcase were pamphlets that I had printed at home that explained what the internet was and what a website was. And I would go door to door trying to convince the stores on Yonge Street to have websites. It didn't go very well. So that was actually the dawn of my internet entrepreneurship. Eventually, that company grew to have its own office, a maximum of about 11 employees. We were turning over about $1 million a year, doing mostly corporate accounts.
I do see the website still. Is that the same company? I'm not sure. There's a website by that name.
By Cyber Young?
No,
I didn't even know that.
Eldan-software.com, something like
Limited?
that.
No, that's not them. I own
Okay.
eldan.com, which unfortunately remains inactive. Maybe one day I'll resurrect it.
Okay.
I own it still for nostalgia purposes, to be honest.
True.
I walked
So
up
these
and down
pamphlets were to help people understand that you're doing this stuff, and like the door-to-door sales guy does it in that kind of stuff.
Well,
Okay.
you have to understand, this was at a time when
There was
knew
no
what the
mails,
internet
no
even
internet.
was. You would say internet, and they would say, "What do you mean internet? What's the internet?" And the
Okay.
question was always the same: does my neighbor have it? They didn't care if it was something they understood or not. What they cared about was, do my competitors have the same thing? Whatever this website thing you're describing is, I want it if my neighbor wants it, which was fascinating. So we grew this company. We ended up developing an integration product, but then the 2001 .com bubble burst. The investors that we had been courting ran for the hills. And like many startups, you hear about the success stories, but we were one of the many failures. We ended up having to close the doors, and I had to let my employees go and breathe a big sigh of, oh, well, I guess we didn't make it. And I ended up joining CIBC. This was the early 2000s, and they brought me in as an integration whiz kid who knew about web services and service-oriented architecture and SOAP and WSDL. And I really brought that knowledge to CIBC and helped them develop an integration practice around the idea of APIs, open contracts, and abstraction against all of your different internal systems and all of the fun stuff that goes with that. I was part of the architecture team at CIBC for about 15 years. It was a great experience. I learned a lot. I learned a lot about things I had taken for granted when I was a young entrepreneur. I don't think young entrepreneurs appreciate the complexity of what happens inside a large organization until you live it. You tend to think, oh, they're so slow, they're so dumb. No, often there are good reasons why they are slower than you might like. And it's not because they're dumb, it's because they're large, and a large entity is hard to move. So I learned a lot at CIBC about the realities of the enterprise. And in my travels, you mentioned the framework, I should say. So later in my years in CIBC, we matured from SOA to modern APIs, REST, JSON, eventually open APIs, the notion of a developer portal. And in my travels, I was being an evangelist for an in-house kit we had developed called the API Foundation. The reason we chose to roll our own was because when we looked at the market, it felt like all of the integration vendors were sort of out of step with where the technology was headed. They were still based on this notion of centralized gateways and sort of routing traffic, whereas more and more the world seemed to be moving towards containerization, microservices.
I think the fancy word at that time when you started off, perhaps would be ESBs and all of that broker, message broker, VC broker, all that TIBCO kind of stuff.
Exactly. Starting with the EAI vendors, the I2s and the web methods and the TIBCOs, and then eventually that morphed into the ESB SOA model, where suddenly you had lighter weight stuff like data power, appliance-based solutions, but also things like various kinds of
Beyond and VC broker and
Strong Loop. Yeah, all these guys who built bus sort of technologies. And MuleSoft has been there sort of along the way. And Axway was there along the way. But in the last 5, 6, 7 years, you've really seen this move towards containerization and microservices. And as a result, the way you tackle integration challenges changes radically. It's not just about your APIs. It's not just about moving from SOAP to REST or from XML to JSON. You have to fundamentally think differently about how you deliver those APIs, who you focus on when you're creating them, and the kind of result that you're trying to drive. In my experience, historically, SOA and integration in general was very much based on cost rationalization, cost reduction. But when everyone switched to REST and JSON, largely driven by the rise of mobile, the impetus for integration really changed. It changed from this defensive cost reduction, rationalization argument, beautifully captured by the notion of spaghetti, which is, if you've worked in IT, everyone knows what I'm talking about. You've got spaghetti, the diagram with all the lines. Here, buy my magic box and you will clean up the spaghetti, and it will look more like a bow tie, usually. My box in the middle, and then all your systems, which never works, by the way. But the argument was always one of rationalization, cost reduction. When we switched to mobile-driven APIs, that dynamic sort of got inverted, and the impetus for integration suddenly changed from this cost rationalization to innovation, this completely different driver, this idea of, no, now I'm all about helping developers create amazing digital experiences and become empowered, and my mobile app has to keep up with the other guy's mobile app. Well, now you have a different challenge. This isn't about reducing costs anymore. This is about delivering efficiently and quickly and making sure you can change things easily. Well, that means this isn't just about your APIs and your gateways. That's just the tip of the iceberg. What's going on underneath? If you're still dealing with giant monolithic applications, it doesn't matter how good your APIs are. If you haven't broken that problem down, you're only going to deliver as fast as your largest component, right? So if you're still running a giant, I can only update this once a year sort of a system, that's how fast you can innovate.
Yeah, you could have all the concurrency issues at the back end, all the data locking still there in the monolithic. And on an ornamental way, you could still call yourself as service oriented on the front side of things. I totally understand that world. Yeah, correct.
Yeah, exactly. And even service oriented is one thing, but even once you've got the abstractions, how do you increase your release cycles? That comes down to
absolutely
decomposing your monoliths, applying the strangler pattern, moving towards containerization, DevOps, Agile, etc., which is this whole thing that is roughly called digital transformation.
Correct.
Not an easy thing to do, right? A journey of years, as a recent guest on my show described it. But coming back to my story, we built this wonderful kit that tried to take a more microservices-centric approach to integration that we call the API Foundation. It was based on a microservice chassis pattern, similar to what you would see from a Spring Boot. But then we extended it to really be sort of a proto service mesh. Like, this was before the notion of service mesh really came along.
Okay.
But we introduced this idea of sidecars and sidecars handling the intermediation. And we're very proud of ourselves.
Like the proxies. Sidecar would be your analogy for proxy sort of stuff.
Correct. Exactly. This notion of creating micro gateways that act as proxies for the legacy systems.
Correct.
So they are the only face to get at the back end. And we were very proud when suddenly service mesh became a pattern and products started to emerge, and Google and others got behind Istio.
Yeah.
The team and I, we all looked at each other and went, well, I guess what we've built is called a service mesh now. And we went from there.
So it's like saying that we were agile even before people knew what the word agile stood for.
Yeah.
Exactly. Stuff like that. Yeah. I have heard long timers say that we always worked in an agile fashion, and only now the term is caught up, that kind of stuff. So yeah.
It's funny how IT is. I remember a good friend of mine, a programmer, when REST came out and he read Roy Fielding's paper, he went, well, yeah, of course, this is how you write, a web-based API. You follow this leveraging of the methods. And exactly as you said, sometimes IT tends to fill in a gap that you had in your head because other people were.
Very true.
So I ended up doing a lot of evangelism for this thing we had built, the API Foundation. We did win an award from Celent for it. I'm incredibly proud of that. And in my travels, when I was doing conferences and that, talking about what we built, I was at a conference in Stockholm and I ran into a gentleman named Gunnar Berger, and he had the most curious title, Head of Open Banking. And I said, what on earth is open banking?
Oh, okay.
I watched his presentation and then I went out for drinks with him. And honestly, it changed my life. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't sort of concentrate on regular work. I became immediately obsessed with this whole idea of open banking. I watched YouTubes of UK legislators arguing in Parliament about data rights and PSD2. And I decided I have to be part of this. This is going to change banking forever. And I actually went back to CIBC and tried to make a case for them to stick their neck out and become part of open banking and be very bullish on open banking. Unfortunately, that didn't work out. We talked about large organizations earlier. And ultimately, I decided that if I wanted to do what I wanted to do in open banking, I couldn't do it from within CIBC. So on very good terms, I put a lot of work into making sure they were left in a happy place. I ended up leaving to pursue my place in the open banking community. And the first thing I did was start the MrOpenBanking Podcast and really focus on that brand and trying to become part of that global community. And we can talk more about what we're trying to achieve on the show. Just as I'm launching the podcast, COVID gets really serious all around the world and everybody goes into lockdown. And now I find myself in this funny position because I'm unemployed. I have this new podcast and I'm really eager to become part of the global open banking community, but I ultimately am not getting any income. So I have to figure out, how do we get a sponsorship? Can I do some consulting work? Is there some way to sort of monetize this, but still be able to do the show? And in my travels, I came across Axway.
Okay.
They were a very interesting company to me. I knew they'd been doing enterprise integration for decades. I've been doing enterprise integration for decades. They were always there helping us at CIBC do parts of our integration practice that others really didn't even want to touch, like managed file transfer. And most of all, I loved that it was the CEO himself, Patrick Donovan, who invited me down to Phoenix just as all the flights were getting shut down and said, look, I want to hear more about this. Fly down here. Let's go out for burgers. So that's what we did. And I managed to convince him of the opportunity behind open banking, and that the right integration vendor who approached the problem the right way could really create something great. And I decided to ultimately join as their head of open banking. And that was about a year ago. It's been great. I have really two roles. One is a member of the Catalyst team, a group of elite API consultants who have real world experience distributed all over the world, multiple languages, a great group of people. And I help create that thought leadership and help our accounts understand how to approach APIs the right way. But then the other part of my role is helping take our platform, Amplify, and create an open banking solution that sits on top of it, works with it to provide turnkey open banking capabilities to our clients. And we're currently piloting that in Brazil.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I think that's an interesting journey that you had. And this gentleman whom you introduced in your talk, he said he was head of open banking. So which company was he from when you met him?
Nordea. I should have mentioned that.
Nordic.
So
Nordic region.
That's right. At Nordea, who is to this day considered one of the leaders in open banking.
That's
they
nice.
Really embraced it early. And that was thanks in large part to Gunnar's vision.
Yeah, that's how I think all these
vibes. Out there, Gunnar, hello. Yeah.
Yes, so I think that's how the vibes from these conferences polish your career and hone your skills along the way, I suppose.
Correct. Correct.
Yeah,
Yeah, that was the idea. I started off. That was one of the first ones I did,
sure,
and
sure.
since then, including Zoom calls, I must have done a couple of hundred.
Okay, okay. So, yeah, one more thing. This Axway, is that either a bank or it's an integration platform, or they are like an API integrator for a lot of banks, or they have their own bank as well? So, what is it like?
So Axway is an integration platform provider or an API management provider. You would
Okay,
see us in Gartner comparisons alongside people like Dell Boomi or MuleSoft or Apogee. We rank very highly in all of those comparisons. So both in Forrester and Gartner, we are in the upper right quadrant and ahead of the curve and all of the rest of the good stuff. So we are a proven, robust, secure API management platform. And we also give you a bunch of tools for being able to get at all of your systems and sort of stitch them together. And that's really where we've been making great strides. We're really trying to approach the challenge of integration a little differently than others. We like to say we're the platform for building platforms.
okay,
And the reason that we emphasize that, we don't have a hub. We're not trying to force all of our transactions through some sort of aggregator. We want to give you the platform that you need to build that kind of stuff. So
yeah,
if you want to be the hub for a bunch of banks, or you want to create a SaaS, an open platform that invites developers in a particular context to participate in your ecosystem, we give you the tools that let you do that.
okay, okay,
Now, I mentioned that we approach integration a little differently. And this is one of the things that intrigued me about Axway, and one of the reasons I joined. When I met with our CTO, Vince Padua, he sort of showed me where we were headed, where we are today, and it really intrigued me because of my challenges at CIBC. I remember that my old boss at the bank used to ask me what seems like a simple question. He would say, "Hey, can you just show me all of our APIs? Just whatever APIs we have across all of our systems in a list, just give them to me so we can start to govern them and track pricing." Almost impossible to do.
yeah, yeah,
Almost impossible. The thing we ended up doing was naming project managers in the different divisions of the bank would go and chase people with a spreadsheet and say, "Hey, head developer, could you please fill this in?" You could do it for the new stuff. So I mentioned API Foundation. Yep, we could
yeah,
give you a
yeah,
list for API Foundation. We could probably give you another list for, say, the SOA bus. But to give you everything across the batch systems, the queues, the mainframes, the different siloed systems that exist invariably in different solutions, the innovation teams who are running things in cloud, online banking, who usually has their own sort of fiefdom happening and their own APIs that they protect. How do you bring that all together into one place so you can see it all if you're
yeah.
enterprise architecture or
I
dealing
remember
with
there were
government?
tools to extract APIs from legacy code and give you a nice HTML doc saying this is what it is, and that kind of stuff. At least that could help you to an extent. But yes, the bigger question is you'll have to finally take the call on what in my world will be an API that will make business sense for me. I think that's a bigger question.
Correct. And in order to answer that question,
Yeah,
the obvious next question is, show me what I have right now. Show me my integration assets. Show me what I have to work with. And it's remarkable how difficult that is in a large enterprise to actually do. I remember at CIBC, we were looking for something that could help us create that, you could call it a meta view of all of your different control planes of all of your different systems. Well, it turns out that's what Axway had, and that's what we've been working on. Our platform is called Amplify, and the piece of it that does what I'm describing is known as Amplify Central combined with the unified catalog. Now, Central is a SaaS service, so you use it in a SaaS format, currently running in AWS, and we're looking for tenancy in other clouds. But the way it works is actually sort of remarkable. Using command line interface or very lightweight agents, what Amplify lets you do is sort of tap into the header traffic into the actual traffic that's happening across all of your systems, whether that's batch, legacy, mainframes, asynchronous queues, SOA buses, modern gateways, including competing gateways. So I want to stress that point. It doesn't have to be an Axway gateway. It can be an Azure gateway, an AWS gateway, MuleSoft gateway, CA, Apogee. We don't care. We can speak to all of them. All the way up to microservices, service mesh. We can tap into all of that traffic and give you, really for the first time, a single view of all of your systems in one place across all of, we call them.
This is similar to, I think, this is similar to what Istio uses a control plane to inject all the proxies into whatever
so
they
let's
manage.
use, right. Correct. So let's use Istio as an example. It is that notion of a proxy pattern. But what is Istio? Istio is a control plane, and it calls the sidecars underneath it a data plane. Now, fundamentally, all integration stacks follow this similar pattern. There's this control plane, typically an API gateway of one sort or another, right? And then there's the data plane, which is the resources themselves. Service mesh is unique because it says, well, I'm going to push a lot of the gateway functions to these proxies in my data plane, but I still have this Istio control plane that's speaking to the proxies, doing service discovery, stuff like that. Now, if you read the literature on service mesh from Red Hat and other, O'Reilly has a great book on it, it introduces a third layer. There's the data plane, which is your sidecars. You've got a control plane, which is your service mesh, your Istio. But the literature talks about something else. It says there's something called a management plane that exists above the control plane. And it describes it as, well, what if you've got multiple service meshes? And then some of the literature goes further and said, well, what if you want to manage multiple control planes that may or may not be service meshes? So that's what Axway leaned into. We call those the federated control planes. So if you consider your MQ system or your legacy adapter or your batch system control planes, and the data they're moving around is, of course, the data planes, the actual files and so on, then you sort of start to see a world where everyone's running a collection of different control planes. And as we continue to innovate, well, you're only going to get more, right? This idea of the spaghetti world where, don't worry, standardize all your systems on my little box and everything will work. That's ridiculous because you'll never standardize on one. And as we try and innovate faster, it's less and less likely that you're going to standardize on one. You are going to have lots of control planes, lots of gateways, lots of service meshes and microservices and functions as a service. So the challenge becomes, if with innovation comes complexity, and that's just the cost of innovation, is this complexity of systems, how do you wrap your arms around all this complexity?
Sorry to interrupt you. Eyal, sorry to interrupt
sure.
you. Just to understand what you're saying, the Amplify product that you've actually developed helps people to connect legacy and all other services hooked up on the control plane. And for that, the basic requirement is you need to be implementing it all by means of a service mesh pattern, right? So service mesh is the pattern that needs to be there for it to work. Yeah, am I correct? Or it can even integrate legacy, which is service-oriented architecture stuff also.
And anything that's running APIs. So service mesh is just one of many things that we can speak to. If you look at the pattern in the abstract, it's got similarities, but it's really anything. And we do it in a way that doesn't require you to replace your gateways or add an additional hop. We basically just look at the traffic and say, okay, based on the traffic I've observed, these are the APIs you've got running in each of these systems.
So you can potentially have a microservice talking to a service-oriented architecture artifact from the old world.
Oh, I'll do you one better. You can have a batch job ending, triggering a call to a microservice, which forks out to a couple of cloud gateways running
Correct, because the real world is like that. True, very true.
Correct.
In banks, the real world is still like that.
Exactly.
Very much. Yeah.
So we give you that ability to see
heterogeneous
all your integration assets in one place. We call it the single pane of glass. And that is your management plane.
Correct. So you don't have to be at the level of a service mesh pattern. It could be heterogeneous stuff lying in your environment where there's legacy, there is batch, very true,
Right.
microservices, service oriented architecture, and all of that. And then, as you said, somewhere in your talk, I did mention the next best thing is going to be serverless architecture or function as a service, which is, of course, still not got the fancy of a lot of people. It's a lot of vendor stuff is logged in, only AWS, Azure. They have the heavy infrastructure to make that a reality, that kind of stuff. So I think maybe that's the reason why people have stayed away from that. And did I lose you? I think your screen froze to a second. So I was wondering whether there was an internet glitch. Okay, no problem. No problem. Yeah, so I think that's one thing. And yeah, one more thing that I wanted to quiz you on was, during your consulting catalyst engagements that you talked about, how do you define as the most important API? Because when you consult with companies, people don't know what to open up in their interfaces and make it public. The more decentralized you are, the better you win at in the economy and the value chains. So who does that job? Do you have a set of guys who understand the domain and then they help you exploit that domain well? Okay, because not all needs to be exposed well, things like that. So because you say account opening, there are 100 guys, fintech companies who are doing account opening. There are 100 guys who are doing payments. There are 100 guys who are doing mobile-based app exchanges. So who takes that call? Do you have domain experts who help you to, expose that layer of it?
Yep. So ultimately, each organization is going to have to decide which APIs are important for them to expose. And they have to deal with that.
At times, it could also be, sorry to interrupt you, it could also be that you're sitting on a mine of data, and you don't know what to exploit and what not to. So probably unless you're wearing the C-level hat in the company, you don't have that level of autonomy and say, okay, go this way or that way, that kind of stuff.
It has to be approached as a business decision. And this really comes to the kind of work that I do with my fellow catalysts at Axway, these kinds of conversations. How do you help an organization get off on the right foot with APIs? How do you help them measure the right things and deliver the right kind of outcomes? I will use as an example a metric that is sometimes used by large organizations, but frankly is in isolation the wrong metric, and that is number of APIs, right? As organizations have moved to innovate quickly and try and break things and empower developers, some of them have latched
Yes.
So yeah, that's a great question. The first things organizations have to understand is you have to approach your APIs like they're products, like they're real products, and make the decision about which ones you're going to expose and which ones you're going to leverage as if you were talking about real products in the case of banks like credit cards and mortgages, and approach them with the same seriousness that you would approach those kinds of products. A lot of organizations still see APIs not as a business asset, but more as a technology asset. And they end up defaulting to a lot of the same approaches that they took historically with things like SOA and older forms of integration. And as a result, they end up sometimes following the wrong metrics and looking at the wrong things for success. For example, number of APIs. That's a really common one. A lot of organizations, because they're not sure what to measure, they're not used to treating APIs like products, they end up defaulting to, well, how many APIs do I have? Count them. More equals better. That in isolation is not a good metric. If you're a developer, you know that taking one API and turning it into 10
you could
APIs,
be very rightly said. I think you could just have one or two APIs, but if they are in the right place in the value chain, you can tend to make more money in the whole bargain than measuring the number of APIs that you've exposed. Like Pieces or PayPal, for instance, those kind of guys.
Plaid is one API. They built an empire on one well-written API. So this notion of I need 100 or I need 1,000 or look at me, I have 10,000 is specious. It's not that that's a bad thing to measure. It's that you have to measure it in relation to other metrics as well. And this
Very
comes back to the kind of work I do with the catalysts at Axway. We help organizations get off on the right foot with their API programs, measure the right things, bring the right stakeholders to the table early so that you can have those business level conversations, define those business level metrics for success with your API program, and get off on the right foot. So many organizations fail at APIs because they didn't have those early conversations. They didn't define what they mean by success.
Very true.
Now, once you've got those stakeholders, you can start to have a serious conversation around, can I build my own account open or should I outsource the account open? Maybe I build my own account open and then offer that as a service for other people to use account open capabilities for their organization. So figuring out where you're strong, where you're weak, what do you build, what do you buy and improve and then republish? Those conversations are very specific to each individual organization. It comes down to your strengths and weaknesses. Okay. However, in general, I would say move towards an open world rather than a closed one. Realize you probably don't want to do everything on your own. You want to look for opportunities to outsource the pieces where perhaps you're weaker, that you don't want to do on your own, that you want somebody to take care of you doing. So find the right SaaS providers, find the right technology providers like Axway to help you with the pieces that you don't want to worry about, and focus on what makes you unique. On the open side, think about unbundling your capabilities. Don't try and pull people into your ecosystem and keep them there. Instead, try and tear down those walls. Take what you offer and break it down into small pieces that can be offered separately, and try and incorporate those small pieces into other people's experiences. So instead of pulling everyone towards your ecosystem, try and follow them to wherever they're going and embed yourself in those experiences. And the way you do that is, of course, through APIs.
Yeah, I think I remember this case of a large bank in the US, which actually opened up the entire APIs, and they started offering them like a licensed, like bank in a box sort of a model. You don't need to have a bank. We'll white label your bank for you and give it to you. You could, I think it was Jack Henry. So they made tons of money by just opening up their APIs and said, here is what you can get for $10,000. You could be a small cooperative credit union, but you can have your own white labeled solution from us, that kind of stuff. So I think that's a very interesting area. And I think as we go further, what's been your thing? Like, they say banking is important, not banks. And fundamentally, the way people are doing business today is hugely, I think, one part of what you said in the previous conversation reminds me of the fact that you need to open up your infrastructure in a way in which you can completely productize the whole offering, like the way Amazon did it. They built AWS for only to consume themselves, but it is so good that they opened it to the rest of the world, and that started making more money from their retail business, that kind of stuff. But banks are like large, huge, monolithic dinosaurs which are sitting there. Well, how do you think, because while you're changing the bridge, then somebody is changing the scaffolding, and it's like everything changing so fast and quick. Because I've seen in my own experience, companies took 8 to 10 years, 12 years to mature their SOA. And when they came to the SOA stage, next 2 to 3 years, people are already discussing, why don't we change it to microservices and make it modular banking? Break everything down into bits and pieces, because there were guys who would say, like, earlier, I remember the deal discussions used to be like, I pay you 50 million, you give me your entire core banking solution, or 100 million, we buy that from you. And but now they say, like, I'll pay you 2 million, 3 million, but give me only the retail part of it. I need only the treasury part of it. But banks are not ready to, that kind of stuff. So I think it's a right time wherein the agile world, the DevOps, as you said, the continuous delivery and microservices, all of them are helping get this stuff done. I remember in one of your talks, you mentioned about the 4 pillars of transformation that's required for open banking to happen. Requires, and it's very timely. I think the market has all of these things to help you get there. And so how much do you think is actually, are you also influencing regulations in the market for open banking? Eyal, what's your experience? Because that's one way to entice banks into saying, okay, we're not compliant, we're out of business. Or is it more a market driven push that customer doesn't care whether it's regulatory or something? It's easy for him to do stuff. He says, okay, goodbye to a bank, and then does peer to peer message pinging and then transfer money. So what's been your experience on
So
that regard?
there's no question that at this point, open banking, this thing that started in Europe, has spread all over the world. This notion of, I'm going to create a standard for the secure exchange of financial data within my region's financial ecosystem. The genie is out of the bottle. It's an incredibly powerful idea. Some people like to define it as this notion of data ownership, that clients have control over their data. Yes, that's an important aspect, but I think it's a little distracting. I think most standard. It's the idea of, when you need account details, or when you need balances or transactions, or to move money, you can call all the banks in the banking. And we talked about, Kieran, did I lose you again?
Yeah,
Oh, no,
I think it was choppy. I just lost you for a minute or so, half a minute, I suppose. Yeah, so you're talking about regulators versus the market push. So which one triumphs eventually?
Right. So look, that question, a classic open banking question, market versus regulator. Already, we have seen working examples of open banking all around the world. And the answer to that has become pretty clear. You need them both. They have to cooperate. They have to cooperate in some regard. There's really no avoiding it. At the very least, the regulator has to give a pass to the consortium who's taking a market-driven approach to sort of go ahead. There has to be cooperation with both to get along, and there has to be good-spirited cooperation. If the regulator and a market-driven entity end up at odds with each other, that's going to slow you down. So even in the US, probably the most popular example of a market-driven ecosystem, you're already seeing FDX start to work with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and try and find a way to do it together. So the answer is together, to all those regulators and market entities out there. Do the right thing, work together to put this stuff in place. You asked, am I personally trying to influence any of that cooperation? Absolutely. That is one of the main drivers of the podcast. We try and have those people who are driving the real standards all over the world on the show to talk about what works and what doesn't, and how to help the others out there move along.
True. I think your screen has frozen. Yeah, looks like. Yeah, I think.
Simulation. We're looking at phase 2 in July.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And me personally, I'm Canadian. I am a member of the OBIC up here in Canada, which is a nonprofit that's trying to drive open banking in Canada. And I work alongside them, along with other champions of open banking in the Canadian community.
Okay.
Oh,
yeah, sorry.
Hello, Kieran. Hey, Kieran. No,
Hi, Yel. I think
no
some
luck
internet
today.
glitches is spoiling the show. So
I
now,
know.
nevertheless, I think we
When I
are
get going,
almost correct. Correct. We have almost reached the end. So perhaps one or two more questions, and then we will end the show. So
sure.
yeah, I think you said you're trying to influence the Canadian regulatory stuff. Yeah, one second. Okay, it's recording. No problem. I was wondering whether the recording was missed, so it's on
Yeah.
record. Yeah. So one more thing was. I think, as you said, the metaphors have changed in the industry. Like architects are thinking very fluid, like an organism. Like it's so fluid. I remember B had a product, so it called Aqualogic. So Aqualogic
I
is
remember
water.
Aqualogic Service Bus. I worked with
Yeah,
it. I know exactly what you mean.
yeah.
Yeah.
So Aqualogic. So you put water into a container, it takes the shape of that container. And I think I like your metaphor of where you refer to like instead of hardcore buildings that are there, and now it's mostly organisms and all that sort of stuff. So you are fluid. You can easily, the blurring of the boundaries is very much there with APIs. You don't know where a company starts, where another one ends. Like you're taking a Uber ride, you could make your payments, you could order food, you could book your stay all at the same time, not knowing, without leaving the Uber app, giving you a feeling that it's all under the same umbrella. I think that's the promise of the open API ecosystem, as you said. And
It really is this notion of being able to constantly change, right? The stuff from my talks that you're referring to, I like to say, build for change, right? Even if tomorrow somebody takes out Uber or some new capabilities come along that maybe require a completely new interface with people as voice starts to take off or other IoT type approaches. What has become apparent is in this world where software is eating us, change is the one constant. It's not about building that one perfect app or that one perfect feature. It's about recognizing that tomorrow there's going to be another feature, and the day after that there's going to be another feature. And how do you create systems that, instead of trying to be like a clock, right? Perfect. I've designed it perfectly. I've written it. It's perfect. Now it's untouchable, perfect mechanism. You have to think a little differently. You have to think, no, I'm building this thing knowing that it's probably a little broken, knowing that it's probably going to have to be improved and changed. And I've built that into the architecture. And that's what this move towards distributed systems architecture, containerization, microservices is really all about, building for change.
Yeah, I think the architecture ends up being emergent instead of big upfront design kind of stuff. So as you progress, the way appears, and I think that's a very nice thing. I think the next step would be from open banking. I've seen people talk about open finance, open economy, and all that sort of stuff, which is actually happening. Where the smart cities are being managed, citizens' data is all open. Back in India, we have something called Aadhaar, like equivalent of a social security number in the US, I suppose Canada. So that's made a lot of things easy. Like you go to walk into any facility, you get APIs, just your fingerprint, and then you're already, they know who you are, that kind of stuff. So I think we're living in very interesting times. What do you think would be your words of advice for somebody trying to build a tech career, technology career, from what mistakes to avoid? And I think, how should one be an API architect? I think you're the best one to answer that. What should qualities should have, and of course a technology leader, because you won all the hats. So yeah, yes, Eyal, please walk us through that.
So keep an open mind. This is an ever-changing industry, and it's only becoming more and more open every day. The standards that the world is currently putting in place, and yes, absolutely, things like Aadhaar and UPI are perfect examples of these kinds of standards, are laying the foundation of the next layer of the internet. So if you're going into technology right now, you should be very excited. There are some very powerful capabilities as we speak being baked into this thing we all share known as the internet. The ability to move money around instantly, the ability to verify identity, the ability to move data around securely with consent. These are incredibly powerful foundational things on which the bright IT minds of tomorrow are going to come up with stuff that today we really can't even imagine. I feel like the work I'm doing today is like the stuff I used to do in the 90s when I was still learning what the internet was and what the fundamental building blocks were. I'm incredibly excited to see what the next generation is going to bring to these commoditized standards that we're currently building. In terms of advice, I had a young person once ask me, the great thing about IT is that it's not just one thing. There are lots of different jobs in IT. Rather than chasing the one that you think is the most lucrative or has the most sort of job opportunities or will help your advancement inside an organization, I would be a little more thoughtful. Pick the part of IT that you really love. For me, it was integration. It always has been an obsession of mine, even going back to those days in my parents' basement. This question of how do you get system A to talk to system B and share data was always something I thought was very, very interesting, an interesting problem to solve, to do it in lightweight ways. And I based my whole career around this one part of IT. But for some people, it's AI. For some people, it's big data. For some people, it's programming the microservices themselves and creating the service meshes. I would encourage those who are looking at a career in IT to follow the thing that you are passionate about within IT, and good things will happen.
Perfect. I think as all great things start in the basement or garage, you had one of your own similar experience. So
I did.
Thank you, Eyal, very much for your time, and wishing you a great week ahead. And let's be in touch. Thank you. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.